In the summer of 1900, Galveston was the richest city in Texas. By some accountings, the third richest city in America. A port that shipped more cotton than almost any harbor on Earth. By midnight on the 8th of September, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 of its people would be dead. More than any natural disaster has killed in America before or since. And the future this city had spent 60 years building would pass within a single generation to a rival 50 miles inland, a city that did not even have a harbor. At 5 o'clock that Saturday morning, September 8th, 1900, Isaac Klein drove his horse and buggy down to the beach at Galveston and watched the ocean arrive in a way he had never seen. Long, heavy swells were rolling in from the southeast, spaced 1 to 5 minutes apart, breaking against a wind that blew the other way. The tide was already sliding over the low streets at the south end of town. Klein was chief of the United States Weather Bureau station in a city its boosters called the New York of the Gulf. He wired Washington before breakfast. Unusually heavy swells from the southeast, overflowing low places south portion of city. He carried a sentence with him that morning, 9 years old, printed under his own name in the Galveston Daily News. The idea that this city could ever be seriously damaged by a storm was, he had written, simply an absurd delusion. The city beneath his buggy wheels stood on sand. Galveston Island was a bar the Gulf of Mexico had built and could take back, and its highest natural point rose 8 feet and 7 inches above the water that had made it rich. Klein had studied that water his whole career, and he had about 18 hours left to be wrong. Among the thousands the sea was coming for that night was his own wife. The best harbor in Texas was an accident of sand. Galveston Island is a barrier island, a long, low ridge the Gulf piled up out of its own sediment, and behind it the water lay deep, calm, and sheltered, the only natural deep water harbor on the Texas coast. The gift and the danger arrived as a single package. The same sea that made the anchorage had made the island, and what the sea builds, the sea can repossess. The man who bought the gift was Michel Menard, an illiterate Montreal-born boy of the fur trade who learned to read in Illinois and lived among the Shawnee, who chose him as a chief. In 1834, he arranged title to a league and labor of land on the island's eastern end, and after Texas won its independence, he paid the young republic $50,000 to clear his claim. On April 20th, 1838, the Galveston City Company began selling lots. 50 miles inland, the same era produced a different kind of founding. In August 1836, the brothers Augustus and John Allen paid $5,000 for a half-league of swampy prairie on a sluggish stream called Buffalo Bayou. Within days, they placed an advertisement in the Telegraph and Texas Register announcing a town named Houston, promising the great interior commercial emporium of Texas, a port where ships from New York and New Orleans could sail right up to the door. There was no port. There was barely a stream. When the first steamboat, the Laura, worked its way up in January 1837, the bayou was so choked with snags that the last 16 miles took 3 days, and the passengers nearly went past the new town without seeing it. Two cities, founded 2 years apart on opposite propositions. Galveston was nature's gift. Houston was a salesman's promise, and the gift came with terms nobody read. Menard himself never collected. Financial reverses broke him in the 1850s, and he died in 1856, the founder of the richest ground in Texas. Not rich. For the next 60 years, everyone knew which proposition was winning. $38 million. That is the volume of business the firms along a single Galveston street, the Strand, transacted in the 1 year of 1881. More than $1 billion in today's money. They called it the Wall Street of the Southwest. It held the 5 largest banks in Texas, the cotton factors, the wholesale merchants, the shipping agents, and in the years before the Civil War, the auctioneers, who sold human beings, a trade the street's admirers mentioned less often. The fortune was cotton, and the work of it had a sound. In the late 1800s, anywhere from 700 to 1,400 ships a year called at the wharves. Down in their holds worked the screwmen, the best-paid men on the waterfront at $5 and later $6 a day. Gangs heaving on great jackscrews to pack the bales so tight that a ship could carry 10 to 15% more cotton than she was built to hold. The wharves themselves belonged mostly to one company. The Galveston Wharf Company controlled 7 of the roughly 10 wharves on the harbor, and its rates were resented far inland. Critics called it the octopus of the Gulf. Merchants in Houston dreamed of never paying it again, and one man went beyond dreaming. In 1876, the shipping magnate Charles Morgan dredged a 12-foot channel through the bay to a landing below Houston and sailed his steamers past Galveston entirely. The channel was shallow, the economics thin, and Morgan's line gave it up within a decade. But the idea was lying there now, in the mud of Buffalo Bayou, waiting. Galveston barely looked over its shoulder. It was busy becoming the most modern city in Texas. The state's first telephones rang here in 1878, its first electric lights in 1883. In 1881, the island won a statewide election to host the first medical college in Texas. An Irish immigrant architect named Nicholas Clayton was raising the city's stone face, hospitals, churches, and the Gresham Mansion, $250,000 of turrets and carved granite. Down on the sand stood Clayton's Beach Hotel, a wooden pleasure palace on cedar piles with its dome painted in red and white stripes, until a fire of undetermined origin took it down to the sand in 25 minutes. Behind the gaiety sat arithmetic nobody performed out loud. Every bank, every bale, every chandelier stood on ground the Gulf had made. And down the coast, the proof was already in. Indianola, once the second port of Texas, was wrecked by a hurricane in 1875 that killed at least 150 people. It rebuilt. In 1886, a second hurricane finished the job, and by 1887, Indianola was abandoned, handed back to the sea. Galveston read the papers, sent relief, and went on cutting down its own sand dunes, the island's only rampart to fill low lots. The man who owned the $250,000 mansion had a problem worth more than the house. Walter Gresham was a leader of Galveston's Deep Water Committee, formed in 1883, and the problem was a bar of sand lying across the mouth of the harbor. The age of the shallow draft schooner was ending. The steel steamships taking over the world's trade drew more water than the outer bar allowed, and a port that could not float them was a port with an expiration date. The stakes were plain. Solve it, and Galveston owned the commerce of the whole American interior, Kansas wheat and Texas cotton funneling across its wharves to the world. Fail, and it was Indianola with better architecture. Gresham's committee did something shrewd. Rather than beg alone, it gathered representatives of the western states and united them behind one demand: a single great deep water port on the Texas coast, and Galveston as the place. It worked. In 1890, Congress passed a Rivers and Harbors Act carrying $6.2 million for Galveston, north of $200 million today, and President Benjamin Harrison signed it on September 6, 1890. The city threw itself a deep water jubilee that ran through the winter. Out into the Gulf crept 2 jetties of pink granite from the quarries at Marble Falls, and the jetties pinched the tide until the tide itself scoured out the channel. By 1897, there were 26 feet of water over the bar, and the flywheel began to spin. Before deep water, Galveston shipped about 22% of the Texas cotton crop. By 1900, it shipped 64%, more than 2 million bales a year. That was the problem the city chose to solve. There had been another candidate. After Indianola was wiped from the map, Galvestonians proposed a seawall between the city and the Gulf, and the proposal died. The city government declined, majority opinion concurred, and the most soothing voice belonged to the government's own scientist. On July 16, 1891, the Galveston Daily News published an article by Isaac Klein of the Weather Bureau, explaining that the low country to the north would let any storm tide spread harmlessly across the bay, and that the opinion that Galveston would someday be seriously damaged by such a disturbance was simply an absurd delusion. The dunes kept coming down. The city had spent $6 million federal dollars to let the ocean in and declined to spend anything to keep the ocean out. At 7:30 on the evening of September 8, 1900, Isaac Klein stood at the front door of his own house and watched the sea rise 4 feet in 4 seconds. The day had begun almost as a holiday. Sightseers down at the water to watch the extraordinary surf. Because high water was an overflow, and an overflow was a show, Klein was not entertained. He had already raised the hurricane flags without waiting for Washington, and around noon he issued a hurricane warning on his own authority. By 3:30, water covered the streets of half the city. At 6:15, the anemometer registered a 5-minute average of 84 miles per hour, and then it blew away. Klein later estimated the wind at 120 or more. Modern analysts make the storm a Category 4. The barometer sank to 28.48 inches. The gulf on one side of the island and the bay on the other rose until they met, and the city between them went under. Around 50 neighbors had crowded into Klein's house near the beach because he was the weatherman. Near 8:30, the house rolled over with everyone inside. 18 came out alive, riding the wreckage through the dark. Isaac surfaced holding his 6-year-old daughter, and his brother Joseph brought the 2 older girls through. Cora Klein, pregnant with their 4th child, did not come out. The survivors drifted 3 hours on the ruins of their own home. 3 miles down the beach stood St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, 90 children and 10 Sisters of Charity. As the water climbed, the sisters cut a clothesline into lengths and tied the children to the cinctures at their waists, 6 and 8 to a nun, and to keep them calm they sang Queen of the Waves, an old French hymn for sailors in peril. When the buildings fell, 97 of the 100 died. The 3 who lived were boys, William Murney, Frank Madera, and Albert Campbell, who rode out the night together in the branches of a tree. Searchers later found 2 of the sisters across the bay, each still holding children. Sunday morning, the counting began, and it has never quite finished. 6,000 dead was the cautious figure for the city alone. Fuller estimates ran to 8,000 and beyond, out of a population under 38,000. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. 3,600 buildings were gone, a third of the city, $20 to $30 million in the money of 1900, well over $1 billion in today's. There were far too many bodies to bury. About 700 were loaded onto a barge, weighted, and committed to the deep by black men conscripted for the work at gunpoint. The sea refused the cargo and returned the dead to the beaches. After that, Galveston burned its dead on pyres, day and night, for weeks, and passed out free whiskey to the men who fed the fires. A weather observer named John Blagden wrote home that Monday, "Every few minutes a wagon load of corpses passes by on the street." Clara Barton came at 78. Galveston would be the last field operation of her life. The first help came from the rival. Houston, 50 miles inland on solid clay, had taken the same storm as a hard blow and shrugged it off within days. Its relief trains were among the first to reach the survivors, and thousands of refugees rode them back the other way to be fed and sheltered in Houston's churches and halls. The generosity was real. So was the arithmetic that traveled home with it. Every Houston merchant who walked the ruined Strand that September returned to a city standing some 50 feet above the tide and did the sums. Houston's newspapers pledged that the island would rise again. Houston's businessmen began planning for the trade that could not wait for it. What the storm did next is why this is a story about two cities. It did not break Galveston's nerve. Within 2 weeks, the city's business leaders were redesigning the municipal government itself, replacing ward politics with a small commission of experts, an invention roughly 500 American cities would copy. What the storm broke was the argument. For 60 years, Galveston's answer to every rival had been the harbor. After September 8, 1900, every dollar looking for a home on the Gulf Coast carried a new doubt about what the water could do. And doubt, unlike wreckage, cannot be cleared away. The tool that saved Galveston was a screw. The same hand-turned jackscrew the cotton gangs used to pack ships would now be asked to lift a city, and the city would need thousands of them. First, the wall. On September 7, 1901, the eve of the storm's first anniversary, the Texas legislature approved the act that let Galveston build its defense, and the county brought in a board of 3 engineers, Alfred Noble, Henry Clay Ripley, and as chairman, a retired brigadier general of the Army Engineers named Henry Martin Robert, known to every gavel in America as the author of Robert's Rules of Order. Their report, delivered on January 25, 1902, did not flinch. A wall of solid concrete facing the Gulf, 17 feet above mean low tide, 16 feet wide at the base, 20 tons of concrete in every running foot, faced with granite boulders. The first section, 3 1/3 miles of it, was finished on July 29, 1904, at a cost of roughly $1.6 million, north of $50 million today. The wall was only half the answer, because a 17-foot wall around an 8-foot island is a bathtub waiting to fill from behind. So Galveston attempted something no American city has tried at such a scale before or since. It raised itself. Engineers marked out 500 city blocks, and contractors dug a canal 20 feet deep and 200 feet wide straight through the inhabited town, so that dredges could float among the houses and pump sand up from the harbor bottom. Some 16 million cubic yards of slurry went under Galveston, a few inches in some blocks, more than 10 feet in others. Over 2,000 buildings went up on jackscrews, gangs of men turning in unison, a fraction of an inch at a time. St. Patrick's Church, 3,000 tons of brick, rose 5 feet on 700 screws, and services were never interrupted. The last of the fill was pumped in 1910 for about $3.5 million more. The examination came on August 17, 1915, another hurricane comparable in strength to 1900, and by the tide gauge slightly worse. The water ran 3 inches higher than in the Great Storm. Behind the wall, the city lost perhaps a dozen people. 15 years earlier, it had lost thousands. The wall itself came through with 2 chips in the concrete near 39th Street. Henry Robert lived to see his design examined and passed. The city announced its recovery in pink stucco. The Hotel Galvez opened facing the sea in 1911, built by local businessmen to tell America that Galveston was back, and nicknamed the Queen of the Gulf. But a grand hotel is a bet on visitors rather than cargo, and the visitors who came over the following decades came for pleasures the Chamber of Commerce did not print. With Prohibition, 2 Sicilian brothers who had arrived as barbers, Rosario and Salvatore Maceo, Rose and Sam, began by slipping favored customers smuggled wine and ended by running the island. Their Balinese room sat at the end of a pier running 600 feet out over the Gulf, where Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, and the Marx Brothers played to rooms holding Houston oil money and, some nights, Howard Hughes. The pier was the security system. By the time Texas Rangers had sprinted its length, the tables, cards, and chips had folded away into pockets hidden in the walls and floors, and the Rangers found nothing but citizens at dinner. Asked by a state committee why he had never raided the place, the county sheriff explained that the Balinese Room was a private club, and he was not a member. The era earned the island a name, the Free State of Galveston. It was a dazzling second act, and none of it was a port. Tonnage, the trade the island had been built for, was quietly going elsewhere. Galveston had built the most famous seawall in America. Houston had spent the same years digging. On November 10, 1914, Woodrow Wilson pressed a button in Washington. A cannon fired on the bank of Buffalo Bayou, and the Allen brothers' lie came true 78 years late. The mayor's daughter, Sue Campbell, scattered white roses onto the water from the deck of a revenue cutter and spoke the words, "I christen thee, Port of Houston. Hither the boats of all nations may come and receive hearty welcome." The road to that button ran straight through September 8, 1900. While Galveston spent its decade walling and raising, the money moved. 4 months after the storm, on January 10, 1901, the Lucas Gusher blew in its spindletop down the coastal plain near Beaumont, throwing oil 100 feet above the derrick at 100,000 barrels a day for 9 days before anyone could cap it. The Texas oil age had begun, and the new industry wanted a headquarters city with banks, with railroads, and with no memory of drowning. The Texas Company, later called Texaco, moved its offices to Houston in 1908. Humble Oil, the seed of what became Exxon, was chartered in 1911. By the start of the Depression, 40 oil companies kept offices in Houston. The city still lacked its harbor, so it bought one. Congressman Thomas Ball had pressed the case for a deep channel up Buffalo Bayou since the late 1890s, and in 1909 Houston's mayor carried to Washington an offer no American locality had ever made. Houston would pay half. The committee accepted the Houston plan unanimously. Congress approved it in 1910. And the 50-50 split invented for Houston eventually became the standard for the whole country. In January 1911, Harris County approved the bond issue by roughly 16-1, and when the bonds found no buyers, a financier named Jesse H. Jones called in Houston's bankers and placed the entire $1.25 million issue within 24 hours. The dredges cut Buffalo Bayou to 25 feet, and the work was completed on September 7, 1914, 14 years, almost to the day, after the storm. Then the ironies compounded. Galveston's harbor was nature's own. Houston's was dug, artificial from the first shovelful. The dug harbor won. Refineries lined the channel, 8 or 9 of them by 1930, a year in which more than 2,000 ships called, and Houston ranked 3rd in the nation in foreign exports. The state's own historians rendered the verdict flatly. By 1936, Houston, a man-made harbor, had become the most important port in Texas. The censuses read like a court record. In 1900, Houston counted 44,633 people to Galveston's 37,788. In 1910, Houston counted 78,800, and Galveston, for all its heroic engineering, counted fewer people than before the storm. By 1930, Houston stood at 292,352, 5.5 times its old rival, and the race was over. On the island, the makers of the Golden Age met their separate ends. Nicholas Clayton, who had built the city's face, lost a ruinous legal fight over a courthouse contract, went bankrupt in 1903 in a city that had stopped commissioning monuments, and died in 1916 with almost nothing. William Lewis Moody, Jr. made the opposite wager. He stayed, founded the American National Insurance Company in 1905, and a bank 2 years after, bought the newspapers, and then the hotels, and spent half a century proving that a fortune could still be made on the island. It just could no longer be a port fortune. And the Free State met the state of Texas. In 1957, Attorney General Will Wilson's Rangers closed 47 gambling houses, smashed some 2,000 slot machines, and shut the Balinese room for good. The entertainers and the operators decamped for Las Vegas, and no one replaced them. No storm could be blamed this time. The island's second economy was put down by its own state. Tourism collapsed with it, and the Strand, the Wall Street of the Southwest, rotted into a warehouse district. Out of that rot came a third act. The Galveston Historical Foundation opened a revolving fund in 1973 to buy the Strand's iron-fronted buildings before the wreckers reached them. Dickens on the Strand followed in 1974, and the district was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1976. Much of the money in the will belonged to George Mitchell, a Galveston boy, the son of a Greek immigrant who had made his billions in oil and gas and would later crack the code of shale fracking. He restored the old blocks one by one and helped bring Mardi Gras back to the island in the middle of the 1980s. The city that lost its future learned to sell its past. What it could not restore was its standing argument with the sea. The wall was aging, and the sea had not stopped. 6.5 millimeters a year. That is how fast the sea has risen at the Pier 21 tide gauge in Galveston Harbor since 1904, roughly 4 times the world average, partly because the water is rising, and mostly because the island, its groundwater pumped away, has been sinking to meet it. The total so far comes to more than 2 feet of gulf that Henry Roberts' board never planned for. You can walk the whole argument in an afternoon. The seawall runs 10 miles now and has become the city's front porch, a boulevard laid on top of the concrete. At the east end, cruise ships tie up where the cotton fleet's anchored, and Galveston is today the busiest cruise port on the Gulf of Mexico. 1.5 million passengers in 2024, the island's past repackaged as its product. In the Strand, Clayton's iron fronts stand restored. The Galvez is still pink. And at 2107 Seawall Boulevard, there is only open water and sky, because at 2:10 on the morning of September 13th, 2008, the eye of Hurricane Ike crossed the island and took the Balinese Rooms Pier out of the world. Ike did not come over the wall. It came around the wall, flooding the city from the unprotected bay side, and it cost the island's largest employer, the medical school, won in that statewide election of 1881, $710 million in damage and nearly 4,000 jobs. The ledger of ironies closes where it opened. The man-made harbor beat the natural one, and Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States, and its ship channel moves more foreign tonnage than any port in the country, while Galveston's ranks 91st. The catastrophe gave America a new form of city government. The raid that cleaned up the island created the ruin that preservation turned into a living. The storm that stole the city's future is now its leading attraction. One entry stays open. After Ike, engineers revived the island's oldest idea at a continental scale, a barrier of gates across the mouth of Galveston Bay, the Ike Dike. To close the door the sea keeps using. Congress authorized it in December 2022 at an estimated $34 billion, a figure since revised toward 57. As of late 2025, the first engineering and design contracts had just been signed, and of the federal share of $21 billion, about $500,000 had actually been appropriated. Design is expected to take years, construction a decade or more, if the money comes at all. At dawn, the swells still arrive from the southeast in long, patient intervals, the same water Isaac Klein drove down to read. The island still stands 8 feet above the Gulf, behind a wall built to 17. And at Pier 21, the gauge takes its measurement, as it has every year since 1904, and the number is still going up.